Welcome to our afternoon of panels and following a delightful lunch and a great morning. I'm Katrin Kuhlman. I am going to be moderating this session. I'm a fellow at the German Marshall Fund, and I'm part of a project called Transform Africa, which Dr. Terry will also talk a bit about. The work that I do is focused on trade and development policies and making them more demand-driven and more market-driven, more reflective of needs on the ground, as well as work on the development corridors in sub-Saharan Africa, which will also be covered by the panel today. So we're particularly, I think, excited about this session, which is going to go into some of the pressing issues that we've already covered this morning on why trade isn't living up to its potential. We had a really good luncheon speaker, I think, where we talked about the promise of AGOA and the potential of AGOA, but the fact that the reality hasn't yet met up with the potential. And what we're here to do today and tomorrow is to think about how the potential and the reality can meet up. I think one of the exciting things, too, about the group that we have here for this is that it covers such a wide breadth of expertise, organizations, different areas of focus. The beautiful thing, I think, about civil society, and I was told that a question came up about what civil society is. And when we talk about the Civil Society Forum, what exactly do we mean? And I think that when we talk about civil society, we mean a number of different things, but all coming together with the purpose of trying to drive some of the policies and some of the programs that we see governments working on in a different direction. So it's everything from think tanks to faith-based organizations to advocacy organizations here in Africa, focused on different aspects of the U.S.-African relationship, and particularly the economic relationship between the United States and Africa. But we also have business organizations, and I think that part of what's made this discussion so rich is that we have a number of business groups ranging, all along the scale. So covering small business, medium-sized business. I was delighted to hear some of the comments at lunch today from some of the women's groups who are here on the importance of making sure that women are integrated into the economic system. So what we're going to talk about today in this panel is how we can step down a little bit from this question of how to make trade work and look at the market systems themselves and where they're working and where they're not working, and how that needs to be part of the approach that we take with this. So we've had a really good morning, I think, and had a great discussion on agriculture where we talked about sanitary and phytosanitary measures, tariff rate quotas, market access, some very nuts and bolts issues that I think we all need to keep in mind, and some things that we all need to come together on. And what we're going to talk about now are some of the infrastructure challenges, some of the capacity challenges, what an integrated supply chain looks like, and what kind of policies. And by policies, I'm talking about at every level, at national level, particularly at the regional level, since so many of the solutions really do have to be regional. Considering the number of countries in sub-Saharan Africa and the number of countries that are landlocked in sub-Saharan Africa, markets are regional by nature. But international as well. And we've already talked about some of the international solutions. I think some of those weave back into the discussion here today. So again, just to summarize, we have three great panelists, and I'll introduce them in just a moment. But we are going to focus on the regional approach and how that factors into this, how we can identify and prioritize infrastructure needs. We all talk about infrastructure. It's something that came up a lot this morning. But it's a tremendous challenge. And the World Bank, for example, estimates that half of the infrastructure in Africa doesn't go where it's needed. So somehow, as we're all working together as civil society, as this collective force to try to push for the right kind of change, we need to be thinking about where that infrastructure should be going and how we can make sure that the infrastructure investment that happens is infrastructure investment that's going to meet the needs of everyone, including farmers, including women, including those who are right now isolated from market systems. So how can we look at the supply chain comprehensively? We're going to talk about several different elements of the supply chain. Processing, we talked about packaging at lunch. We're going to talk about storage. And then again, what do the policy responses to these things look like? So without further ado, then I'll introduce the panel. Each of them is going to do a PowerPoint presentation, and then we'll open things up for questions at the end. So we're going to start actually all the way to my left with Mr. Greg Gajewski, who's going to go first in our star lineup. But you can wait for just a second before you get up. I'll introduce everyone else, and then you can get up.
10 minutes is tight.
I know. Greg has been just on my case about not giving him enough time for the presentation. So I told him maybe I'll let him go over just a little bit. But I just want to make sure that we have time for questions from all of you. But Greg is a very experienced economist, has over 25 years of experience. He is right now vice president with the Berger Group. He manages an economic and policy practice there. He's worked around the world in a number of countries, in Africa, Tanzania, Egypt, Kenya, Uganda, Rwanda, South Africa, and a number of other places as well. And one of his specialties is looking at transport feasibility and how that relates to poverty reduction. So he's actually going to talk about something that I've been doing a lot of work on, and that I think is an important element for us to keep in mind as we think about how to make AGOA more effective, and that is how to build regional markets and enhance food security and increase trade through the development corridors. So he's going to give a presentation on that. We'll explain what they are and how they work, and we're delighted to have Greg starting us off. So wait, don't get up yet. Don't get up yet. He's just so eager to go so that he can get some more time for his presentation. I know it. So immediately to my left is Dr. Eugene Terry, who is just a very valued colleague of mine. He's part of the project that I work on, Transform Africa, which I mentioned. He has years of experience. I learn from him all the time in agricultural research and development. He has several degrees and a lot of experience with plant pathology and protection. He knows more about some of the specifics of what we were talking about earlier than most people I've ever talked with, and is able to impart that knowledge in such a lovely way that I think we'll all learn from him in his presentation today. He is doing a number of things at the moment, including working on Transform Africa, but he's also, prior to this, he was the Director General of the West Africa Rice Development Association. He was with the World Bank for a number of years. He was the founding director of the African Agriculture Technology Foundation. And most recently, which I love, so he won a presidential award for outstanding contributions to rice research and development from the president of Mali. So he has a wealth of experience and is going to talk today about how agricultural development can be a transformative process. He's going to focus on a particular product, Cassava, and how it was transformed from being a subsistence product to being more of a traded commodity product. And I think that story is going to tell us a lot about how we can think about expanding trade under AGOA, and how agricultural trade can grow. So we're excited, Dr. Terry, to hear your presentation. And then rounding out our panel is Richard Tracy, who has also years of development and experience in international development. His areas of specialty are business development services, delivery, agribusiness development, and microfinance. And he is right now the Director of International Programs with the Global Cold Chain Alliance. And as all of you whose work is associated with agriculture know, cold storage is a particularly important element of the supply chain, a particularly important element of ensuring that agricultural trade can expand. So what he's going to talk about today is how you establish a cold chain that functions well, and what some of the challenges are in Africa to establishing good cold chains, because many countries don't have well-developed cold chains. And without that, it's very difficult to expand agricultural production into certain products. So that will be his presentation. So Greg, now you can come. You can start. We'll go in that order and look forward to your questions at the end. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for that nice introduction, and it's a real pleasure to be here. Just get this show going. Okay. Actually, is there a mic I could hold? Is that a possibility? Okay, I'm going to talk about how to link farmers, smallholder farmers, with rural roads, secondary roads, onto what are called transit corridors into international markets. One thing that you didn't hear about this morning is that, is this on? I don't hear it. Anyway.
Here we go.
Yeah? All right. Basic layout of the presentation is as follows.
Test.
We've got to go, no, it doesn't matter. We're going to go from connecting the smallholder farmers to right down to international markets. One thing that most people don't realize is that when you talk about transportation in Africa, billions have been invested. So one of the important things we have to talk about is road financing and road management and maintenance. Another thing is that how high of a proportion of cost transportation is. Transportation makes up about 50% of the cost of the food assistance, for example, that the U.S. gives to Africa. 50% of the cost goes to actually delivering that food assistance into Africa. Okay, now, one of the things we're going to be talking about is the Strategic Development Initiative, the SDI, which is something that came up, that Nelson Mandela came up with. Usually with the anchor projects at either end, these are usually big industrial projects, aluminum smelting, so on. People often think of these corridors in a very industrial sense. But what we want to do is start to transform this into thinking about them as also agricultural connectors. Because as has been said, 75% of the African population is involved in agriculture and lives in rural areas. So the problem is, okay, you can see you can see up here, nice connection, a good way for farmers to get their product to market, the local market, take it into the international market through this trunk infrastructure to a port and then out to the world. But what about out here? These farmers are not connected. And this is a very large problem in Africa. Most people are not connected. So we have to talk about not only building primary roads, main roads, international roads, but we also have to be talking about the secondary and tertiary roads that connect the farmers to the hamlets then to the main road and on. And then all the market infrastructure that goes with that. Now, corridors are not a new thing, but they're a very big thing. There's a lot of development assistance from the African Development Bank, the World Bank. All of the international financial institutions are behind these corridors. This is a very out-of-date map, but it'll give you an idea of where these corridors are, where some of them are. We'll go through some others as we go along. Now, the key really is the farmer, the individual. As we've already heard at lunch and earlier, most important unit is the family. So, development economists have been thinking about this for a long time, and it's very important to remember that we're talking about farmers and how to help them market their product. Okay, well, that means that the public sector has certain roles and the private sector has certain roles. The public sector has to provide what's called the enabling environment. Land tenure is always important, otherwise farmers won't invest in their own farmland. If they don't own it, they won't treat it well. And again, maintenance of roads. That's a public sector function that can be contracted out to the private sector, but if it isn't managed well, the road is going to fall apart in about 10 years. So what happens is what has happened in the past, and thankfully is being corrected in most countries, is that a main road, a trunk road is built. A feeder road is built. Farmers get confidence that they're going to be able to sell their product in markets using that connector. But then, without the proper maintenance, those roads go away, and if you're stuck growing a cash crop and can't get to the market, what are you going to do? All right, but that's not all. Agricultural research, as we know, is a very important thing, developing new varieties and so on. The ag research has to feed into ag extension. Ag extension doesn't work as well as it might in Africa, and part of the problem is the farmers are very conservative, and for very good reason. They have to survive. But one way around that is to have demonstration farms. That's something we've found very successful in the United States, something that can work in Africa as well. The private sector has to manage the market infrastructure, has to make sure that the fertilizers get in, that the seeds are sold to the farmers at the right time. Credit, the infrastructure for credit has to be provided. Crop insurance. Now, the public sector can help with this, but there's only so far that the public sector can go with these items. And so on, you can see. And of course, we've been hearing all day about government accountability. Now, this particular set of corridors is often called the North-South Corridor, or is the North-South Corridor is in here. Some of them are built and maintained, some are not. A lot of the ones that are built and maintained are where the private sector has a huge interest. Those that are not well maintained or not well built, where the private sector does not have a huge interest, and where the heads of state, the government, is not really supporting the development of the corridor. This corridor happens to be the biggest success story in terms of corridors. Right after the Civil War in Mozambique, it's a very cheap electricity because of a dam left over from the Portuguese. It paid to suddenly make aluminum. The aluminum is shipped to Joburg. All kinds of industrial development. The port was completely concessioned out to the private sector. The maintenance of the road is managed by the private sector. And indeed, the Corridor Authority is a private sector entity that is owned by the firms that use the infrastructure. That's not always the case, but in this particular case, it's what we see. This corridor, this is a very important corridor, and traffic was falling. There's a corridor authority, and this is something that I kind of skipped over in the interest of time, but is something that's important to remember. These corridors are international. And you've got national governments worry about national interests. Then you have SADC and COMESA, and they worry about regional interests. But there's only going to be one institution that cares about the maintenance and upkeep of the corridor, and that is the Corridor Authority. And it's a good idea to have a corridor authority for each corridor. Otherwise, they get into disrepair, people get disappointed, and how do you then regain that? It's very difficult. Anyway, the Corridor Authority here saw problems, saw that drivers could not drive from one country to another without making a lot of payoffs. The Corridor Authority took action, worked with all the regional governments, improved the infrastructure itself, but also got rid of the soft barriers to trade. So now traffic is up, and that corridor is doing very well. This particular corridor is one we're working on now. It's funded by the African Development Bank. It runs from the port of Mombasa in Kenya through Uganda, Rwanda, Burundi, up into the DRC, and then from here on, you've got the Congo. The Congo is navigable 365 days a year with the proper navigation aids, although it doesn't have that now. The reason this corridor is not well maintained or not well put together is lack of political commitment from the leaders of the countries involved. They are paying attention to other issues. However, this corridor has great potential to tie farmers from southern Ethiopia, South Sudan. It's a huge region of the world. A lot of people could benefit if this corridor were improved and maintained. Oftentimes we talk about public-private partnerships as being some kind of magic bullet. Anybody who's familiar with RVR, with the RVR concession of rail in Kenya and Uganda, might disagree with you. If the agreements are not properly drafted, if the private partner does not have enough capital, they don't work. So, for example, if you're talking about Kenya Rail and Uganda Rail right now, it carries only 5% of the traffic. The rest of the traffic goes by roads. Very heavy stuff that destroys the roads, requires more maintenance, more money, and causes terrible congestion in the cities. Now, the public sector is always responsible for rural roads, and why is that? That is because it's a public good. A public good is one in which you've got benefits that accrue to the economy that are greater than the benefits that accrue to the individuals who use it. You cannot get really the private sector to build these roads. But again, PPPs are the way to go for a lot of the infrastructure, but they have to be structured properly. The government has to take responsibility for certain activities. You pull in the World Bank, it's important. Okay, so accountability is the key word. We've heard about some of the ag trade barriers. But we also have a natural resources trap. And that is where a country depends on a particular natural resource, like Nigeria and oil, to take an example. This leads to a great deal of corruption because there's an awful lot of wealth and weak institutions. There's other reasons why rich natural resources can lead to a trap. Landlocked with bad neighbors. Well, that kind of speaks for itself. Countries in Africa, as we know, drift in and out of conflict. Who's going to want to invest in a country like that? So you need to address the conflict situation. So one last thing is, of course, a great phrase called donor coordination, which to me is a real oxymoron. It's very unfortunate, but the donors do not coordinate. Very often projects overlap, and it would be great if we could see better donor coordination. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Craig. That was an excellent overview of the corridors and regional market development, and you did great and didn't even need more time, but you were fantastic. Thank you. So, Dr. Eugene Terry, I will turn it over to you. Do you need to do anything?
Yeah, we got to go back to the files. We got to end his. Then we got to go to mine.
Okay.
And then we got to project it. Good afternoon. I'm particularly pleased to be here because the topic for discussion is very, very hot. and I'd like to think I can contribute something to this conversation. As I was attempting to consolidate my thoughts on the message that I wanted to leave with you this afternoon, the word transformation became a very operative word. It is the new sexy concept. It is the new sexy terminology. And this need to pay attention to transformation was particularly highlighted when I attended a very important discussion yesterday on AGOA and agri-foods export to the U.S. It was coordinated and moderated by Charlotte, who is here with us today. And I learned a lot from that presentation, from the presentations yesterday, especially in the area of tariff rate quotas and sanitary and phytosanitary regulations. I am particularly pleased that Steve Landy, who was there yesterday, talked a little bit about the transformational aspect of AGOA. It's an aspect of AGOA that tends to be missed because there are three components to it. So let me start off by saying that AGOA we should look at as a transformational proposal. We are also going to talk about Transform Africa, and Greg has certainly elaborated and talked at length about the concept in the African corridor ideas, development corridors idea. So according to Steve, and I agree with him, AGOA is a U.S.-African economic partnership, but it has three transformational components. The one that we all talk about is the trade provisions. But what we don't talk about enough is the fact that it also makes provision for support for African-driven rural economic communities. And it also makes provision for promotion of U.S. private sector investment. And I will amplify this and give you examples of where this would be important in our discussion of the case study that I want to elaborate on this afternoon. So Greg has talked about Transform Africa. I think it will be useful to mention that Transform Africa has three components. He talked about demonstration and the need for demonstration, and for that you need funding. And so one of the components of Transform Africa is the Transformation Fund. A second component of Transform Africa is to remove barriers. We all know that there are enormous number of barriers that impede and prevent trade, free flow of trade and movement of goods and services across regional boundaries. And so that's a very important aspect that Transform Africa will be looking at, removing barriers. I will talk a little bit about that later. And of course, the third component of Transform Africa is the corridor policy network. And as you know, in all of the other parts of Transform Africa, there are enormous policy challenges and implications. I want to use cassava. For one thing, it's my favorite crop. It's my first love. As a case study. And my idea is that the future of this crop is now. For those of you who are not familiar with the crop, I've given you a poor representation of it here, but I hope you can see it. The gentleman you see behind this wonderful harvest is my mentor, and I worked with him to develop these very varieties of cassava. I was the pathologist that worked with him to develop improved varieties of cassava. We started off with cassava as a farming crop, low yielding, and now it's hopefully going to be a commercial crop, very high yielding. Now, what are the transformation barriers? What are the transformation drivers and barriers for cassava? You have some off-farm and on-farm production technologies, some of which we utilized to breed the crop and to increase and improve its performance in terms of yield, in terms of nutritional qualities, in terms of utilization. You have some institutional drivers, and you have some very important policy drivers. I won't go into them. I just want to flag them because I know you know some of them already. And time is short, of course. I saw Daniel just walked out of the room, but I want to give him credit. Yesterday, in his own presentation, he made mention of the fact, and somebody else who was in the room, that when these AGOA negotiations are going to take place, there are about 200 or more United States lawyers who are going to be representing the United States position on these trade issues. And you have about 3 very timid African lawyers who are probably going to be no match for these 200 high-powered United States lawyers. And I think he asked the rhetorical question, what are these African lawyers going to be able to do to make progress for African entrepreneurs and African producers? Well, one of the things he suggested, and I agree with him entirely, and I think it resonates with my theme, is that we must learn how to trade first in Africa. We must learn all of the challenges and the barriers and how to overcome them in Africa before we jump onto the big stage. There is probably $50 billion worth of business to be done regionally, across regional boundaries in Africa, that we have not mastered the art of doing yet. So this is where I think AGOA also has a role to play in terms of helping us with regional integration and the challenges that go with that, especially in terms of support to the RECs. Now, what are some of these keys to regional growth opportunities for my favorite crop, cassava? They are the biological and mechanical technologies for on-farm and off-farm and post-production operations of this crop. For example, one can mechanize harvesting and build in labor-saving devices. One can come up with good mechanical peelers so that you can actually save a lot of your crop through minimization of wastage by good peeling techniques. Cassava products need to start off by being pulverized. Most of the products would arise from pulverization of the starchy root. So you need water extraction techniques, you need peeling techniques and technology, you need pressing and milling for extraction of water. You need drying, toasting, and frying. For that, you need multi-purpose ovens. I'm just giving you a few examples of some of the on-farm production technologies that are required and post-production technologies that will be required. Well, as I say, we want to look first at the regional markets and master those and know the challenges that we're going to face in those regional markets. Some of the eventual marketing opportunities for this crop and some of the new uses are livestock feed, food manufacturing, cassava starch, beer, malting for beer, the need for the right starch quality and the enzymes to degrade these for brewing. And of course, now that we're talking about renewable energy and transformation, also in that connection, we have to look up at the possibility of cassava as a feedstock, as a raw material for ethanol-based industry. So again, we have tremendous local, regional uses that we can first of all attempt to master and to understand the challenges before we jump onto the international and the global scale. Of course, as I said, Transform Africa has the component of removal of barriers, and I thought it might be useful for you to know some of the barriers on-farm and off-farm to growth of this crop. You need to get the scientists together with the engineers and the breeders to overcome some of the heavy losses that occur when you harvest and peel the crop. That is a challenge. It's a major challenge, and you would only begin to appreciate this if you work with that crop. You need to improve the fabrication of the processing machines, and for that you need to, Catherine talked about capacity building as one of the areas that we would certainly want to look at. You need to develop capacity at the village level for fabrication and repair of these technological instruments and the machinery. Infrastructure, this is where again AGOA comes in, because as I indicated in my opening comments, infrastructure, investment in infrastructure would be one of the components, the transformational components of AGOA. And so it is very useful to hear the amount of money that is being spent on transportation costs in developing food aid, and one would ask the obvious question, could that amount of money not be used to develop infrastructure in the continent of Africa? Roads, the location of the factories. Let's not forget this particular crop, and I'm sure it might be the case for a few other crops, it's probably a lot of water. Cassava is 60% water, and the amount of travel and the amount of transportation cost that has to be invested in moving the crop to where it is being processed and where it's being transformed. Here's that word again, transformation. It's a very serious issue to contemplate. And power, lack of electricity, and the need to replace some of these challenges with perhaps well-designed, manually driven processing implements might have some implications also for AGOA. So capacity, infrastructure, investment are areas that I think require considerable consideration. So this is what I wanted to leave with you, that in fact, in talking about transformation, we're not only talking about AGOA as a transformational initiative, we're talking about Transform Africa, which is transformation of agriculture across corridors, development corridors, and finally the transformation of my first love, cassava, from a low-yielding farming crop to a commercial crop that could have a place to play in the world stage. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Eugene. I think that we're all here because we want the next chapter in AGOA to be all about transformation, so I think that's a perfect way to frame the discussion. I'm sure you'll have a lot of questions at the end, but first we have one more speaker, Richard Tracy, who's going to talk about another element in the supply chain and another critical piece in the infrastructure chain, cold storage. So I turn it over to you.
Thank you. Good afternoon. It's a real pleasure to be here today. I think they usually say they save the best for last, but after seeing my colleagues speak, I'm not so sure that I'm in the best position here, because I'm really impressed with what has been said so far and how it really ties into what I'm going to try to share with you today. My name is Richard Tracy. I am with the Global Cold Chain Alliance, and I guess what I want to do here today is basically share with you what the private sector is looking at, taking a look at it from the private sector approach. I do have a lot of experience in development, and it's a great position for me to be in with this organization, this trade association, to be representing the private industry, but trying to bridge the gap to the public sector and trying to leverage our clients' new business dollars, also with the donor money that's being invested in agribusiness development. So I'm going to briefly go over who we are, and then I'm going to share with you some of the things that we have done with the cold chain. And then there's some basic low-cost, no-cost recommendations that we have as an association that we make to get the cold chain started. A lot of times what people say to us is the cold chain is capital intensive. Greg mentioned that for food costs, transportation is 50% of the cost. In the cold chain, transportation is actually 60 to 70% of the cost for transporting goods. So you can even take that, and it's even higher when you're talking about perishable food items. So who are we? We are a consortium of 5 different trade associations, and basically we represent links along the cold chain. Cold storage construction, refrigerated transportation, refrigerated warehouses, and the ammonia refrigeration industry. This is where we have members, this is where we have offices, and I'm not proud to say that the map is kind of dark up here, but basically we have little to no representation in Africa. Like I said, I'm not proud of it, but I do visualize it as a challenge. This is my goal, is to actually get our members more membership, get more activity in on the African continent, and working with people so that we can access the trade corridors and actually get business going, not only for exports of U.S. goods, but also imports. It should be a two-way flow of goods. The thing that I like to say about the cold chain is 0 degrees in the United States is 0 degrees in China. It's 0 degrees in South Africa. It's not a language thing. It's not a culture thing. It is still 0 degrees. And maintaining that cold chain throughout allows us to have the transfer of goods back and forth. Basically, what I like to do is make sure that we know what we're talking about, the cold chain. And we go from post-harvest, processing, transport, warehousing, transport once again, because once it's stored, it has to get out to the retail sector. What is the thing that's missing from here? What is missing?
Good management.
Good management. Yeah, we need that throughout. The thing that's missing is the consumer. Is the consumer on the end. We can't take care of the consumer. The consumer needs a refrigerator. The consumer has to understand the need for the cold chain. The consumer has to be willing to bear the cost of the cold chain. Like I said, 60 to 70% transportation cost means that your food is going to cost more. It means culturally that if you go to the market every day, you don't have to necessarily worry about putting it in the refrigerator. You can keep it in a cool place, correct? But the reality is, as economies grow, as people become more wealthy, as they become more busy, unfortunately we're very busy, they don't get to go to the market every day. They need a place where they can store their products. That means you need a refrigerator at home. And where you see an increase in domestic consumption of refrigerators, you see an excellent need for the cold chain. And what is the cold chain? Basically what we're talking about here is anything that has to be temperature controlled. It can be food products, it can be tobacco, it can be nuts, it can be vaccines. So basically what we're talking about here is a cold chain. A lot of people focus only on food, perishable food items, but I like to make sure that it encompasses everything, because from a business perspective, if we only look at one particular product, the cold chain cannot be, the return on the cold chain cannot be made when you just look at mangoes, when you just look at cassava, when you only look at dairy. It has to be an integrated cold chain to share the cost of the cold chain amongst all the products. In post-harvest, what I want to do is show you some pictures of what is being used around the world. This is a zero-energy cooling system that is done in India. And then this is a modern state-of-the-art facility. Where do you think this modern state-of-the-art facility is? Kenya? It's Ghana. From that picture, you cannot tell. Actually, it's very dark. You can't even tell. And I apologize for that. I'll try to do that better next time. But basically, that is a very modern facility for the export of pineapples. And so they actually do pineapples very well. Why can't they do the rest of the cold chain as well? You know, the cold chain is very fractured in Ghana. When we get down to some pictures of This is poultry processing in Ghana, where the poultry is just laid on the floor of the freezer and is being frozen on the floor. If we talk about food safety, one of the reasons why I love the business that I'm in is we're actually providing safe, quality food to consumers. And when you look at this, you have really significant issues with safety. This picture is of a project that we did in Nicaragua to help them update their standards so that they're able to process meat and seafood and poultry on a higher quality basis. Then, of course, we come back to transport. Are there any transportation people in the room besides Greg? Any transportation? Good. Then, we got a couple. I was going to say we could talk badly about you, but I guess we can't. Transportation is the biggest issue. You can see here in the picture where people are just loading products that need to be proper temperature controlled into the backs of cars, on top of bicycles, on top of motorcycles, direct heat from the sun, traveling 8 to 10 hours, basically destroying the value of that product or shortening the shelf life of that product so it actually spoils within a day or two of being purchased. And that does not lead to being able to maximize the use of that product. Of course, we have modern transportation systems, and you will see modern transportation sporadically throughout. I had a member in the office today who ships 20 tons of poultry to Angola each week. 20 tons of poultry to Angola. And he says that the client in Angola has trucks, has warehouses, has everything to take care of that product properly. So you will see it, but it's just not a system that's integrated and working as a chain. There's many broken links. And again, I just show some pictures here of a proper warehouse that's storing apples, a grading sorting system, and then of course the refrigeration of the product in a poorly stored area. You see it all. The good pictures are from Serbia. This last picture is from Armenia. We have modern facilities. This facility is in Mexico, and then this is a typical facility that you'll see in the United States. What I like to say is that the United States and many developed countries, it's not necessarily the best example to show because the facilities that we use are huge. They're way out of scale, way out of proportion when we talk about the need for electricity and infrastructure to service these particular facilities. And then, of course, we get down to retail. A lot of times you just see in developing countries just the open-air market. I know some countries that I've been into that people actually don't trust the fact that it's been in a refrigerator because of the fact that it's been sitting out all day, and before it spoils, the vendors will put it back into the refrigerator so it doesn't spoil 100%. So that actually indicates to the consumer that it's close to spoiling, so thus I don't want to buy it because it's been in a refrigerator. I'd rather have it sitting out so I can see it and touch it. And of course, what we want to try to do is actually get to the point where we can promote safe handling practices, and that's really the reason why, especially on the meat, seafood, and poultry side, that we want to develop the cold chain. On to the 8 recommendations that we have for low cost, no cost, getting the cold chain started. This is the most important thing. And the number one thing is to have good packaging from the very beginning, putting it in a container that doesn't bruise it, doesn't scrape it, doesn't compress it. So you actually, when you ship the tomatoes, you don't have tomato juice by the time it ends up where it is at. I hope that these presentations are available to you afterwards. Okay, good. If not, you can always just contact me. I'd be more than happy to send it to you or discuss it with you further. Again, low cost. If you don't have a fantastic facility, the best thing to do is just get it into the shade. Pick it, get it into the shade as soon as possible. If you have trees, then it's no cost. If you don't have trees, get some umbrellas and low cost. But as you can see, in this upper one with the umbrella, they're still not packaging it properly because they're putting it in these super huge bags that they have to stomp down and throw them on top of trucks, and it's pushing down on the product, causing loss. In some cases, what you'll want to do is actually pack the product in the field. If it's a high-value product such as strawberries or other types of products that can go, you can directly pack them in the field, and then you want to have a shaded area where the workers can actually pack it in the field. Again, that's just reducing the cost, reducing the temperature of the product to get it down until it gets into a refrigerated system. We're talking about trying to use the corridors and exporting. We need to be training our farmers to